I see that we are at 12 o'clock, and though people will still continue to be joining us, I know that Jim's got a lot to get to today. So welcome, everyone. And we're so grateful that you're with us for our series on church budgets in the Xennial world, pursuing sustainability in 2023 with Jim Elrod. Before I introduce Jim, just a couple of quick things, a little background information for those of you who are new to us. And if you're not, please bear with me. This is a program of the Center for Continuing Education at Yale Divinity School, and I'm the managing director of the center, Kelly Morrissey. I hope you'll join us for other programs this year. You can find information about our upcoming events on our website, and I'll drop that address in the chat a little bit later. We will have time for Q&A at the end of today's session. So please drop your questions directly to me in the chat, as I'll be assisting Jim with that when we get to that portion. And please keep yourselves muted today. Now, let me extend a special welcome to the creator of this series, Jim Elrod. Jim serves on the faculty of Yale Divinity School and teaches courses in financial sustainability and managing crises for churches and nonprofit organizations. He has served on the governing bodies of a variety of nonprofits, including Berkeley Divinity School, Christ Church Greenwich, and Yale New Haven Hospital. Jim has extensive experience with churches facing financial challenges, particularly those with governance issues. Jim holds an AB from Colgate University, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and an MAR from Yale Divinity School. And he is the author of Creating Financially Sustainable Congregations. It's a wonderful book. Dean Sterling feels like it's one of the best he's ever read on this topic. You can find it at Church Publishing or wherever you get your books. I will drop a link to Church Publishing in the chat a bit later as well. So thank you all again for being here. And without further ado, Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you all for joining today. I'm delighted that you could. I hope you'll return on our next 2 Thursdays for the remainder of the series. These are hour-long sessions that are designed to help you reimagine the role budgets and budgeting can play in the life of a congregation and to help you budget more effectively. Everybody see that? All right. Well, if you've tuned in today to learn shortcuts on QuickBooks or how to link Excel spreadsheets better, I'm afraid you're going to go away disappointed. The goal of this series is to explore the role budgets and budgeting can play in moving a congregation from a state of financial equilibrium to one of financial sustainability. Kelly tells me that we've got representatives from religious communities of all shapes and sizes participating with us today, and the right budget for a church of 50 will look quite different from the right budget of a church of 500. So rather than being prescriptive, I'd like to try to set the table today for more in-depth conversations in our next 2 sessions about budgets and the role they can play in attaining financial sustainability by making some observations that I think apply to all churches today. Some of them will strike you as obvious, but I think establishing a common understanding of today's context will serve us well. So the first observation I would make is that all churches have, or at least at one time, had a mission, a plan for how they intended to live their lives as a community of faith. But you can't have a viable mission without money. You can't live out your corporate life if you can't fund the programs and the services that you believe you were called to provide. Second related observation is that the money churches use to prosecute their mission mostly comes from their members. In 2019, before COVID-19 hit, the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at Indiana University conducted a national survey on church financial practices. The Lilly Foundation funded that study because there is no central repository for church operating and financial results. So researchers actually know very little about how congregations receive and manage and spend their financial resources. 1,231 congregations of all sizes and types participated in that study. The smallest had $3,000 in revenue and the largest had 41 million in revenue. And with a response rate of 40%, turns out this is a statistically pretty significant piece of work. The results were published by the Lake Institute under the title, and you see the cover here, the National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices. And one key revelation that came out of that study was that 81% of the revenue in the average American church comes from member donations. So said another way, endowment, interest earnings, rental income, parking income, all the other sources of revenue together contribute only 19% to the top line of the average congregation. The Lake Institute researchers also determined that in 2 out of 5 churches in America, 40% of all churches, 100% of the revenue, all of it, came from member donations. So member financial support is crucial to maintaining the financial integrity of just about every church. Next observation is that the average age of the members of most denominations, and by extension, the average age of the members of most congregations, is considerably older than the US population as a whole. The average age of the US is 38 today, with a median of 46. Pew Research published a study back in 2016 indicating the median age of most mainline denominations. At that point in time, Presbyterians led the pack. The average Presbyterian was 59. They were the oldest. Methodists and Episcopalians were tied for second at 56. Southern Baptists were 54, and so on and so on. In fact, only Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, and Eastern Orthodox communities were younger on average than the US population. Pew's work appeared to validate the results of a study that was published just a year earlier by the Hartford Institute for Religious Research, which concluded that individuals over 65 make up 30% of the average congregation. So you put those together, and I think it's safe to assume that most congregations today, certainly most mainline congregations, are heavily dependent on their older members to maintain their financial integrity. Not surprisingly, when it comes to soliciting financial support from their members during the past 2 decades, most churches have catered to the preferences of the so-called silent and baby boom generations, which of course was absolutely appropriate. Why wouldn't you gear your fundraising and your donor engagement activities toward satisfying an older crowd when a significant amount of your financial support comes from older individuals? The problem for all of us is that time is marching on, and the United States is entering a period of rapid change in terms of the composition of the adult population. Now, of course, some will point out quickly that generations are always in flux, but because the size of the post-World War II generation, the so-called baby boomers, was so much larger than the generations that immediately preceded it and immediately followed it, the magnitude of the change we're about to experience is unprecedented. And one inevitable consequence of the mortality tables is that over the next 10 years, the control over wealth in this country is going to shift from baby boomers to members of generations that follow them. And because the generations which follow them, the Gen Xers from Generation X and the Gen Yers, who are often called millennials, want to practice the art of philanthropy differently than their grandparents and their parents have, church fundraising techniques are going to change as well. So today I'd like to investigate a little further 2 of my observations in more detail and the potential impact they have on church budgeting, mission, and the role it plays in maintaining financial support, and the generational sea change I've just described in the US population that's coming. I think doing this is going to enable us to have more granular conversations around budgets and financial sustainability in our subsequent sessions. So let's talk a bit more about mission and why the interrelationship exists between mission and money. How does a congregation come into existence? Because somebody or some group believes it needs to come into existence, and they somehow made that happen. They might not have had a well-scripted game plan for how to make it happen, but they had a vision. They had a vision on why the congregation needed to exist. The vision is what a congregation believes it's called to do, why it exists, its reason for being. And so visions by nature can be very aspirational. They should be aspirational. When that vision is reduced to words, it's called a vision statement. Now, visions and vision statements can change over time, but they resist change. They don't change quickly, and they don't change often. Here's an example of a church vision statement, an actual vision statement of an actual congregation in South Carolina. Quote, "We exist to connect people to Jesus and each other," end quote. We exist to connect people to Jesus and each other. It's aspirational, it's hopeful, it's expansive, and it's perpetual. There's nothing in that vision statement suggesting that the vision will someday be realized and the congregation's work will be complete. On the other hand, a church's mission is quite different from its vision. Mission is what a church actually does to achieve its vision. When mission is reduced to words, it's called a mission statement. Here's an example of a mission statement, another example from a real live congregation, but a different one from the one I quoted on vision. Quote, "We equip our people to develop a biblical worldview, share the gospel, build healthy relationships, transform communities, and renew culture." We equip our people to develop a biblical worldview, share the gospel, build healthy relationships, transform communities, and renew culture. That congregation believes it's called to do 5 specific kinds of activities to usher in the kingdom of God. I think it's kind of interesting to note that my examples of a vision and a mission statement didn't come from the same church, but they could have. And that's possible because vision statements are typically very general in their nature. Mission statements, on the other hand, are quite specific. In the example I gave you of a mission statement, there are 5 kinds of activities that congregation has identified as things they need to do. Mission for them is where the proverbial rubber meets the road. Mission describes the next steps the congregation is taking in its journey toward realizing its vision. And those specific steps, those actions require funding. So it's possible to have a wonderful vision without money, but you can't make progress toward reaching the vision. You can't have a viable mission without doing things that cost money. I love this quote from Gil Rendell, who's an author and the senior advisor to the Texas Methodist Foundation. He reinforces here the very tactical nature of mission in this way. It's one thing to know our mission. It's quite a different matter to discern what is required first and the subsequent steps that must be put into place to bring us closer to that central purpose. So seriously pursuing a church's mission, making tangible progress towards realizing a vision, involves specific activities that require funding. And the connection between mission and budget should be evident to all of us. Mission is about specific programs and services, all of which must be paid for. And that payment plan takes the form of something called a budget. Budgeting in a missional light is really an exercise in establishing the practical boundaries of a church's mission imposed by its available resources. But what happens when a church doesn't have a clearly articulated mission. Does your church have one? Probably. Is it specific? Is it clear? Could you repeat it from memory? Do you refer to your church's mission when you discuss resource allocations during budget season? Does your current mission statement describe what your congregation actually does day to day? Do you spend your money where your mission statement indicates you will, or is there a gap between missional objectives and fiscal realities? I'm not trying to browbeat you or make anybody feel bad. I'm raising up the difficulty for you of budgeting effectively in the absence of a clearly articulated purpose. Yes, you can generate financial projections that marry anticipated revenue with anticipated expenses, but to what end? How can you help leadership make the best decisions about resource allocations without a game plan? To quote the great Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. Okay. So my first and maybe most important message related to budgets for this entire series is that you can do your congregation a great service by becoming a squeaky wheel about the importance of reviewing and refreshing your church's mission and articulating it in plain language. Clarity about mission has a direct connection to my second topic that I want to review in more detail today, the passing of the baton between generations and the impact that is bound to have on raising money from church members. And for that, you can thank the Xennials. What is a Xennial? Well, originally, and still today, for many researchers, it's a term used to describe individuals born during the late 1970s and early 1980s. It's a label for what some perceive to be a micro generation that seemed to emerge at the very end of Generation X and the very beginning of Generation Y. And as people first sort of explored this, it seemed like the younger members of Generation X were behaving differently from their older brothers and sisters who were born in the mid 60s and mid 70s. The older Gen Xers, or so it was thought, acted differently from the baby boomers, but not that much differently. The younger Gen Xers, on the other hand, seemed to have a lot more in common with the oldest millennials. And there were lots of fanciful theories and labels that were tossed about on why that might be the case, such as they were born in an analog world but grew up in a digital world. None of that concerns us today. And research was conducted on this microgeneration, but it didn't really get a heck of a lot of traction. Most observers, when mentioning Xennials, use it to describe that bridge group, which arrived on the planet at the very end of Generation X and the very beginning of Generation Y. But more recently, the term Xennials has been expanded by some to describe anybody born in the last quarter of the 20th century. In other words, throwing the youngest Gen Xers into the millennials as a group. And for purposes of this presentation, when I say Xennial, I'm referring to this broader definition: individuals who today are somewhere between their late 20s and late 40s. Why do churches care about all of this? Well, for the same reason consumer package companies, retailers, and secular nonprofits care about generations. Because broadly speaking, people born in the same era often act in similar ways and react to things in similar ways. Now, of course, individuals are unique. We all know people who don't act like others from their own generation, but someone born in 1992 who's 30 years old today is going to act a lot more like individuals born in the 80s and 90s than someone born in 1942 who's 80 years old today. Nobody knows exactly why this is the case, but it kind of makes intuitive sense and it's grounded in practical experience. Individuals from the same era spend their formative years in the same culture. They're exposed to the same major traumatic events like war and assassinations and political upheaval at the same age, approximately. And so there's a tendency for individuals from one generation to act in similar ways. And it manifests itself in many respects. And it turns out that one of the areas it manifests itself about how they want to interact and react is with the charitable institutions they support, how they want to engage in acts of philanthropy. The information on this slide comes from Pew Research. It's a summary that I put together of a study that they published in 2020. I should probably mention that the study also included lots of information on Gen Zers, the generation that is just coming of age now that follows the millennials. But because individuals from Gen Z don't yet play a really meaningful role in funding churches, I've chosen to ignore that information in my summary here. You can see at the top, in the first row there, the label of each generation. The next row, the birth years that attach to each one of those labels. And then it gets interesting. In the next row, we see the number of living members, the population by generation in 2019 when this research was performed. Pew then projects what those generational populations will be in 2028. So although the information is a little dated now, it's just 6 years away. And I want to draw your attention to the very bottom row here, the projected change in populations between the generations just 6 years from now. In 2028, the average living silent generation member will be over 90 years old. In 2028, the average living baby boomer will be 73 years old. In 2028, the oldest Gen Xers may be starting to hit retirement age, but the ones we're concerned with, the ones born in the late 70s and the millennials, together the Xennials, will be just entering their prime income years. And they'll also be inheriting the family wealth that's being bequeathed to them by their silent grandparents and their boomer parents. In a different report, Pew extended that population projection out to 2050. And if you look at the very bottom of this graphic, you can locate 2019 when that other study was done, 2028 with the projections we made, and then 2023, just 10 years from today's budget cycle. And there's no real surprises here. The Grim Reaper will take his toll. But the shift in population and thus the control of wealth in this country will accelerate between 2028 and 2033. What does that mean for church budgeting in 2023? Well, to be honest, not a lot. If your church is making ends meet and a significant portion or even a majority of your financial support comes from members 50 years and older, there's no reason to panic. But if your revenue and your approach to fundraising and budgeting doesn't begin to anticipate this generational shift, your day of reckoning may not be far off. Any church that's serious about maintaining or attaining financial sustainability has to start paying attention to how the Xennials want to engage with the philanthropic institutions they support. Now we're going to explore what that means with the assistance of 3 card-carrying Xennials. On your right here, you see Grace Pomeroy. Grace is a faculty member at Luther Seminary in Minnesota. She was born in 1987. Parenthetically, she told me I could tell you that. So she's a millennial whose birth date places her square in the center of this Xennial category. Grace is a very gifted teacher. She's done lots of interesting research on what younger people expect in a relationship with their church. And I've had the privilege of team teaching with her in the past. I hold her opinion and her insights in the highest regard. She's actually profoundly impacted my thinking about generational behavior as it relates to church. And so although we won't be reviewing any of Grace's work directly today or in our other sessions, you should know that almost everything I say about Xennials has her imprint on it. In the middle, you see Scott Harrison. Scott's the founder and CEO of a secular nonprofit called Charity Water. Now, I've never met Scott in person, but we've been in touch by email, and we actually have a few friends in common. Most of what I know about Scott, though, comes from his autobiography called Thirst. I learned there that Scott was born in 1975, so a younger Gen Xer who arrived at the very dawn of the Xennial age. In a few minutes, we're going to look at how hard Scott and his team have worked to make his organization, Charity Water, Xennial friendly. On the far left, you see Lexi Steinley. She's a former student of Grace Pomeroy, and she's just been called, I'm happy to say, as the senior pastor to Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Fargo, North Dakota. Lexi was born in 1990. She also told me I could tell you that, as the Xennial and Millennial era was just starting to wind down. Prior to her call as senior pastor at Bethlehem Lutheran, Lexi served that congregation as an intern, and one of her projects was to reimagine the budget at Bethlehem Lutheran. And we're going to review her budget work in some detail during our final session on September 21st. I'm hoping Lexi's approach will stimulate your own thinking about how to make the topic of budgets and budgeting more accessible to your own members. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to compress lots of research on Xennials and how they think about philanthropy into a few broad generalizations. I'm happy, however, for those of you who are interested, to point you in the direction of some of the source material. You can reach out to me directly or through Kelly. So when it comes to Xennials and charitable giving, it may be helpful to contrast their behavior with that of their parents and grandparents. And the first difference that pops up is that Xennials are more interested in giving to causes than institutions that serve those causes. In fact, Xennials have a fairly healthy distrust of institutions, and they tend to act like their own general contractor when it comes to philanthropy and supporting a cause. Take, for example, food security. If a Xennial is passionate about food security, they might search out and give to 3 or more organizations that address the issue. Maybe a local soup kitchen, maybe a church with a program that feeds the homeless, and perhaps an international social services organization with a significant food initiative like Save the Children. That's a really different approach than the one embraced by your average baby boomer. Boomers do homework on the organizations that they're thinking about supporting, but once they complete their diligence and write the check, they tend to assume that the leadership of the organization will spend their money wisely. They trust that the leadership of the organization will do the right thing. Second, Xennials expect full transparency from the organizations they support. And here's an instance where doing serious work on your mission can pay big dividends. Transparency in the Xennial context actually starts with mission. Xennials want to understand why you exist, what your mission is. That's kind of predictable given their focus on causes. And if they like your mission, they will want to know how their money is advancing that mission. So a lack of transparency about mission or an inability to provide financial or operating results is viewed by millennials with some suspicion. The silents, the boomers, they're not as caught up with transparency. Their allegiance tends to be to place, not program. And as I've said, once they decide to support an organization, they assume that the organization is going to do the right thing. Third, Xennials not only want transparency, they want proof statements. They often refer to proof statements as receipts. A receipt is simply evidence that the organization is doing what it's promised it will do and that it's having impact. A receipt could be as small as a tweet or as large as an independent audit. Xennials are looking for evidence that the organization, with their financial support, is advancing the mission and producing the desired outcomes. And ideally, they'd like to have multiple receipts pushed to them on a regular basis. Silents and boomers are not receipt oriented. Yeah, they might read an annual report if you mail it to them, but their default assumption is that the organization is doing the best it can with what it has. They welcome receipts, but not too many of them and really not too often. Fourth, Xennials want to be all in, or at a minimum, they want to be invited to be all in. They want a holistic engagement with the organization. They don't want to just write the check. They want to be involved in other ways because they care so deeply about the cause that the organization serves. And again, this is very different from silents and boomers. Financial support may actually be their only level of involvement, even if they are following what the organization does closely. And finally, Xennials want opportunities for feedback. They believe their opinions, not just their bank account, matters. So they, anyway, creating venues for feedback through social media, for example, is critical to Xennials. Even if they choose not to engage in a regular two-way dialogue, they take comfort when a charity or charitable organization creates multiple opportunities for them to share their thoughts. And this too is quite different from the posture that the silents and the boomers assume. Boomers believe an organization they donate to will be responsive if they share their opinions. That's what they assume. Older donors don't usually share their opinions frequently, and they certainly don't demand ongoing attention. If they really don't like what's happening, they typically express their displeasure by withdrawing their financial support, often without explaining why they're withdrawing their financial support. So what does all this mean for the practice of philanthropy generally? As the silents and boomers depopulate and the Xennials became a larger and larger factor in the population and on the charitable landscape, the landscape itself is going to evolve, reflecting more and more the desires of the Xennials who will soon dominate it. And here are some of my thoughts on how I think the tectonic plates of charitable giving, if you will, are going to shift over the next 10 years. First, the market itself is going to evolve from an institution-centric to a cause-centric kind of ecosystem. Yes, organizations will still serve as intermediaries, but they're going to have to be able to articulate their mission clearly and explain how their work contributes to the cause they claim to serve. Second, donors won't support an institution just because they think they ought to, but because supporting it gives them a sense of personal fulfillment. Creating bespoke sort of communications that target an individual donor's interests will become the currency of the philanthropic realm when it comes to donor engagement. Third, institutional loyalty will fade while the ability to demonstrate impact will become more and more critical. Just because somebody gave to an organization in the past will no longer motivate them to continue giving. And receipts that demonstrate impact will start to become table stakes, if you will, kind of the minimum ante for maintaining financial support. Pledging, promises to pay in the future, will decline as a technique in favor of contingent support. Yes, I will continue to fund you if you continue to deliver. And finally, trust. Trust, of course, always matters, but transparency and a constant stream of receipts are going to have to be pushed out to the donor community to prove that the trust is still warranted. You're going to have to make it easy for them to verify that the trust is still warranted. And all of that brings us back to Scott Harrison and Charity Water. Here again is an image of Scott, one of the three Xennials that I introduced you to earlier. His autobiography, Thirst, the cover of which you see on the right here, became a bestseller when it was published in 2018. And if you read it, you would have learned that Scott was born in 1975. He grew up in what I might describe as a fundamentalist Christian home, but he headed off to New York City after high school to pursue a career in music, got into the nightclub promotion business, and by his own admission, led a very, very fast life before having a road to Damascus kind of moment at age 28. Scott decides he's got to go cold turkey and clean up his act, and he decides to volunteer on a hospital ship anchored off of Liberia. And there he learns of the devastating effects that a lack of clean water plays on the health of third world communities. After he returns to America in 2006, he establishes Charity Water. Now, Harrison had the advantage of painting on a blank canvas. There was no hierarchy, no bad behaviors to correct, no underperformers to terminate. So Charity Water at inception was all about creating a mission that would serve and realize his vision. Fast forward to 2022. I'm going to show you a few screenshots from the Charity Water website that I downloaded a few days ago. And as you view them, I want you to think about the Xennial preferences regarding philanthropic engagement that I shared with you a few moments ago. Causes, not organizations, radical transparency, plentiful receipts, holistic engagement, and opportunities for feedback. First, let's look at the mission. It's featured prominently throughout the website. Quote, Charity Water is a nonprofit organization bringing clean and safe drinking water to people in developing countries. Now, whether or not the cause of clean water in the third world resonates with you personally, you have to agree the mission's unambiguous. Anybody interested in the cause of clean water is going to find that mission statement attractive, even if they already support other water-centric organizations. Charity Water tells you why it exists, whom it serves, and how it serves them in just 17 words. Think about how that kind of clarity aligns with the Xennial desire for transparency. And not to fast forward too quickly, but it's easy then to imagine lots of metrics that Charity Water might want to put together that can become receipts that prove it's executed against its mission. You know, the total number of water projects completed, the total number of new water projects begun every year, the number of countries served, the number of new countries entered each year, the number of people served since inception, the number of new people served each year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cause, not organization. Charity Water positions itself as a cause masquerading as an organization. It's all about getting clean water to more people in more developing countries. The primacy of cause versus the organization is reinforced by the way the organization operates. There's no got to do it this way. There's no not invented here syndrome. They have no one size solution. Anything that advances the mission is worth talking about. The cause, not the institution, is what matters. Radical transparency. Charity Water posts all of its financial statements, its audited financials, and Form 990s that it files with the Internal Revenue Service every year since its founding on its website. Anybody can view financial and operating information for every one of their 15 years with literally a touch of the button. They also post a proof statement for each year, which demonstrates how all retail donations provided by individual donors in the way they think of things, were spent on water projects, not on administrative overhead. The schedule is reviewed for accuracy and blessed by Charity Water's independent public accountants. So Charity Water is an organization that takes radical transparency to a new level. Plentiful receipts. Charity Water tracks its programs and reports on them frequently. Interested donors can learn precisely which project was funded by them, and thus exactly what impact they personally are making. And they can take comfort, as you saw from the previous slide, that third parties such as Charity Watchdog and Candid and the Better Business Bureau and Aid for Africa have reviewed Charity Water and given it high marks for the comprehensive nature of its disclosures. Holistic engagement. Charity Water not only invites, but encourages donor engagement in addition to their financial support. Yes, they seem to be saying, we want your money, but we want you. Now, my suspicion is they don't get that many takers, but the invitation itself contributes to this aura of holistic engagement. Opportunities for feedback. In addition to inviting engagement, Charity Water goes out of its way to provide specific suggestions on how donors can become more involved. And if you click through to these things, you will see that they encourage a two-way kind of dialogue. Engagement and opportunities for feedback. So I, after reading Thirst this summer, sent $100 to Charity Water. I actually sent it in early August, and I received the obligatory thank you and tax receipt almost immediately, which is not particularly noteworthy. But since I made that donation, I've also received 3 personalized emails trying to lure me into a deeper conversation with them. This is a copy of the most recent one. And if you were able to click through, you would see it tells the story of a former professional soccer player that's got involved with Charity Water, suggesting sort of by way of example that I can too. Now, obviously, attending to all these aspects of donor engagement is a lot of work. Charity Water, at a minimum, deserves high marks for effort. But does their approach actually resonate with donors? Well, Charity Water just celebrated its 15th anniversary of existence. So here's a summary of its financial position at inception, at year 5, year 10, and year 15. If you were to look at the financial results from the intervening years, you discover that that organization, like all nonprofits, has had its ups and downs. And in Thirst, Harrison is pretty candid about missteps and why Charity Water has faltered on occasion in terms of its financial results. But in the grand scheme of things, you have to be impressed. Revenue grew from $600,000 in that first year to over $100 million in year 15. Over those 15 years, I'll represent to you that Charity Water has been consistently profitable, generating a surplus every year. Total assets have gone from 400,000 in year 1 to 173 million in year 15. And net assets, the equivalent in not-for-profit accounting speak of shareholders' equity, grew from 400,000 in the first year to $94 million in year 15. So yes, the approach resonates with people who want to promote clean water in developing countries. Great. Jim, you might be thinking, this is very interesting. What does it all mean for churches and church budgets and church financial sustainability? What lessons can Charity Water offer us? Well, I think the first lesson is mission actually does matter. And doing the work to achieve consensus on what your congregation believes it's called to do in this time, in this place, is really, really helpful. Mission is not the domain of puppy dogs and sunshine and imprecise language. It's a place that demands precision and requires some grit. So look at your current mission statement through the eyes of a potential new member, maybe a Xennial member. What does it say your reason for being is and how you plan to affect it? And then ask yourself, are you in a position where you could demonstrate to that potential new member that you are actually delivering on what you promise? If your mission needs work, if you need to have those conversations, or if your mission statement needs work, the mission's fine, but the mission statement needs work, I really encourage you to make it a priority. Second, church members, the economic backbone of the average church, don't live in a vacuum. They live in an ecosystem that includes organizations like Charity Water and other sophisticated organizations like their college and their kids' school and the local hospital that understand Xennials want a different kind of relationship with the organizations they support, and that differs materially from the one that satisfied members from previous generations. The participants in that ecosystem are changing their behavior, and thereby they're conditioning your members, maybe subconsciously, but they're conditioning your members about what they can and should expect in a relationship with a nonprofit. Now, Charity Water is an extreme example, but I believe they're a leader and not an outlier. Donor engagement strategies that worked fine when silence and boomers drove philanthropy are not going to work well in the near future. And most churches I know still cling to those strategies. Has your church begun adjusting its outreach to accommodate younger members? Is it possible that you don't see younger members in the pews because you're not relating to them the way they'd like to be related to, and that you're not getting the financial support that you think they're capable of providing because your donor engagement techniques haven't changed? Best practices in this ecosystem aren't changing overnight. They're going to evolve. They have evolved and they will continue to evolve. In previous eras, ones dominated by the silents and the boomers, charitable organizations didn't have to do that much to keep their members happy because the silents and the boomers didn't demand much in the way of transparency and receipts and two-way dialogue. Sometimes they didn't really even want a holistic engagement. The members of those generations gave because they thought they should. It was their duty. Xennials have much different expectations about engagement, and these expectations are being validated by organizations like charity water. Now, of course, the supreme irony in all this is that your churches are doing wonderful things as part of their mission. They are the arms and hands of God. So you have the raw material to tell a story that lots of Xennials would find very compelling, but you're not doing it, and you're not doing it in a way that's immediately accessible to them. I believe churches have to find ways to meet the preferences and the needs of this new generation. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon, very soon. Now, evolution, unfortunately, has a price tag. To prosper in the ecosystem I'm describing for you, some churches are going to have to invest more in systems and people. But in most churches I know, it's not the out-of-pocket costs that are the problem. The challenge is changing behavior. To get the group to be willing to share financial results publicly, to take the time to repurpose static information about your programs to tell new stories, different stories, and tell them in different forums, to set goals and acknowledge missteps when those goals aren't reached, rather than reformatting the narrative after the fact and just celebrating what was accomplished. That is a different way of running the railroad for most churches that I know. But I believe you have to begin to change your approach and become more transparent, or run the risk of financial failure, as Xennials account for a larger percentage of the population and a larger percentage of your church's membership.